There's a certain compulsion that the ego is made up of. It's one of its primary functions, and that is self-reflection. To observe oneself, to check how one is doing, how one is feeling, how one is thinking, how one looks in the eyes of either the external other, but mostly how one looks in the eyes of the internal judge. You could say from that perspective that every ego has OCD. It suffers from an obsessive compulsion to check up on itself on an ongoing basis. And this is a function that consumes a tremendous amount of energy, but it also creates a tremendous amount of tension, because the ego is as if always performing on a stage in front of a very judgmental and cruel cast director, which is the super ego, or the judge in the head, which is constantly observing and ready to pounce and punish us with guilt or shame or fear or any of the other negative affects if we step outside of the boundaries that have been defined since early childhood as acceptable or lovable behavior. Now, the objective of this video is to raise awareness to the fact that this is happening, and this is a video that is the outcome of a process of observation, in which the more you, and inquiry, self-inquiry, the more you drill into what am I, what do I mean by I? Well, the function of the I, for one thing, is to separate us 1 degree from things that we don't want to feel. But the other function of the I is to create the sense of being a spectator of our lives. That creates a kind of division. And that spectator is, because it is false, it is just a mental notion as opposed to a real entity. That spectator is obsessed with checking up on itself to see if it still exists. It would almost be comical if not for the fact that it's actually quite tragic to live constantly watching. As an ego, we are constantly watching over our shoulder to see if something is coming that could disprove our validity as an entity. And as I said, the ego as an entity is invalid. We are not an entity. We are not a separate individual, which is why the ego can never let its guard down. It has to constantly guard against existential angst and terror. It has to constantly be performing and judging and being in contention with a world of its own creation to demonstrate that it does exist. And it needs to be checking whether the performance is proof enough that it does exist. Hence, this constant self-reflection mechanism that feels like we're constantly taking a selfie of ourselves and checking how we're doing. Now, the phrase "the ego is a selfie" is, full disclosure, completely plagiarized from Satya. He's an Indian teacher who has a channel called Satya Speaks, which is, to me, one of the better quality channels out there today. He said the ego is a selfie. And I thought it was a very clever turn of phrase. And it was not until after a couple of months of self-inquiry where I came to realize that indeed the ego is completely obsessed with self-concern. It is constantly monitoring, constantly watching, constantly on the lookout. Who's that over there? Are they here to confirm and affirm and validate me? or are they here to undermine my sense of self? Right? So everything is judged as either confirming or undermining our sense of self. And the relinquishing of that self-reflection mechanism is indeed very scary, because it comes with an existential angst. If I stop checking whether I'm still there, will I still be there? Is the question that the ego doesn't want to even remotely get close to. It doesn't want to answer that question. The ego wants to continue running with its obsessive compulsion of checking and monitoring and self-monitoring, if not to call it self-policing, because every time you take a selfie, you make the little duck face and you want to look good, right? And so this self-policing, it wants to obsessively and compulsively do that rather than to cease doing that, because that cessation gives way to a looming void, which will reveal that the ego was never really an entity to begin with, not a separate entity, not a separate individual entity in the first place. So the desisting from checking up on oneself is something the ego doesn't want to do. And so long as we are identified with that mechanism, it's something that is very difficult to drop. But what we can do is we can become, through self-inquiry, more and more acquainted with the fact that we are doing that on a constant basis. We are constantly checking up on ourselves. Am I still there? Is the question that the ego compulsively tries to check and confirm. And that checking gives the ego a mission and a sense of existence, a sense of being. As a matter of fact, it borrows its being from awareness, and it checks up on itself. Now, if we let go of that, what we come to find is that we don't disappear. You know, it's not as if when we stop checking on ourselves and we let go of that selfing and that self-policing, that we suddenly just go into oblivion and vanish into thin air. We continue to be. But we come to realize that our existence, our popping out, was connected to a fundamental being, which is not separate in the first place. Existence is the only way that we can look at ourselves, because we need a vantage point. But that vantage point starts to think itself individual and separate from being. It is as if to say, if I'm the universe, and I am, let's say I'm just the universe being, but I don't know myself. And if I want to know myself, I need to pop out so that I can look back at myself. And this popping out now gives me a vantage point with which I can know myself. But what if that vantage point starts to believe that it is separate? It forgets that it is connected to the universe, you see? And that's kind of the ego. So the ego as a vantage point starts to believe itself separate, but it kind of feels in its bones that its ground for that claim is not very solid, and that creates an obsessive compulsion of constantly checking to see whether it's still there or not. So this is a short video to invite you to, through self-inquiry, discover that there is an unease constantly there. There is a uneasiness to everything that we do, because in our bones, something tells us that our claim to individual separate existence is false. And whether that expresses itself aggressively or or vaguely, or in a way that feels like loneliness or eeriness, or lack of fulfillment, or not knowing what to do with our lives, or lack of feeling connected. It could express itself in a myriad ways depending on our turn of mind and our upbringing. But ultimately, all roads lead to the fact that the claim of being a separate self is false, and therefore the ego has to engage in a compulsive mechanism of doership and self-checking in order for that not to come to the surface, because the prospect becomes too scary to even contemplate. So again, this is an invitation to perform a self-inquiry and to come to become more familiar with that sense of unease, to see what it is made up of, and to see the kind of compulsion that then it creates for us to be taking constant mental selfing, mental monitoring, and mental policing in order to try to appease ourselves. But the very fact that this is compulsive shows that it is that our claim of being separate and individualistic is completely spurious, right? And that is about it, right? That's the essence of today's video. I'm actually quite curious to hear what you guys make of it. And as always, liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel is highly welcome. And I'll be back with more videos pretty soon. Cheerio and bye-bye.